Shar said vanity of vanities, and there's probably some truth in that, but at the same time, I think it's helpful for the video to actually, right, like when you watch the video, you actually want to see the person that it's about. One of the things that is really fascinating about nativity scenes, this is a little tidbit, and it's really, really, if you're an American and you go to Europe and you find this, or you find European flavored stuff, it leaves you scratching your head. But the way that like Italian nativity scenes are done now, they make like a whole village. Like, it's not just a manger scene with a few animals and a few characters, you know, shepherds and angels and those kind of things. It's like this whole town thing. And it's a little bit annoying as an American because you usually have to play the game, where is Jesus? And it's not always obvious. Like, there will be shops and shopkeepers and all these things, and you're like, okay, manger scene, manger scene, manger scene. And sometimes it's big and in the middle, but very often it's just kind of on the side. And if you see, like, one of the big nativity scenes in Assisi, where they started with St. Francis, is like that. Like, there's a whole town and there's a parade of people going to the manger, but finding the manger is not, it's not front and center with like big glowy things around it, you know. And maybe that's cultural. I kind of prefer the nativity scenes that we have, but it is what it is. Okay, where are we at? Like 46. Okay, so we have to make it from 46 to 53. Oh, this is going to be interesting. Okay, John, the sons of Zebedee. All right. So John and James, note that in the group of apostles, there's two Jameses. They tend to traditionally be called James the Greater and James the Less. And I don't know if we know exactly why. It may be that one was taller than the other one, because the word can be used to describe someone's height. But it's also probably that the James that's called the Greater was part of this inner circle of disciples, Peter and James and John. That James is the son of Zebedee. So he is the brother of John. John is likely younger than his brother James. He certainly lives a lot longer. James will be the first of the apostles to die as a martyr. He actually dies even during the time of the New Testament. John has a long life, and he seems to kind of take a back seat for a time. We don't know a whole lot about what happens to him between the death and resurrection of Jesus and his ascension and years later. Eventually, by tradition, he settles in the city of Ephesus and becomes its bishop. And Mary goes there to live with him. And they live in a small, simple house that is outside of the town. John has sort of a funny story. Because in the gospel, at the end of his gospel, Jesus has that kind of funny phrase with Peter where Peter's like, well, what about him? And Jesus says, what if it's my will that he lives until I come again? You know, what is it to you? And so this story comes about that John was going to live forever. And I think the gospel even points out that's not quite what Jesus meant. But the funny part of the story is that by the end of his life, they start trying to kill him, and it fails. So they try cutting off his head with an axe, and I forget if the axe gets dented or the head falls off, but that doesn't work. And so they decide they're going to boil him in a pot of oil, and that doesn't work. He didn't cook. And so eventually they give up on killing him, and they exile him to an island called Patmos, which is where we believe he writes the book of Revelation and has his series of visions. And he ultimately dies at the end of his life a natural death. But it is a little bit odd that, at least by history, by tradition, They end up trying to kill him in a number of different ways and nothing works. It's sort of like Jesus' phrase worked backwards, that you won't be able to kill him. He is one of the only apostles that is like that. It's very, very possible that his gospel he wrote after the other three had become somewhat widespread. Because the Gospel of John is very, very different in feeling, is very, very different in theme than the other Gospels. And it seems like what John does is he tries to fill in some larger themes and some larger pieces about Jesus and who he is. His Gospel is very unlikely to be chronological at all. It's arranged, if you look at it carefully, into 7 days. And they're not 7 calendar days. Like, that's part of where biblical literalism gets you in a lot of trouble. And usually on each day, Jesus does a miracle and he explains what it is. So his gospel is possibly later, but later we don't know exactly what it means. The New Testament is being composed, we think, from probably the 40s and 50s with the early letters of Paul through a somewhat indefinite time period. You can make some arguments that the New Testament was in large part completed before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. You can make other arguments that it was completed afterwards. At the very least, parts of it, pieces of it, were edited afterwards. There's a few things that are clearly a little bit later than some other ones. But again, that's not to cast doubt on the authenticity of the Gospels. It's just part of their history of composition. It's how we got the Gospels that we have. And this you can have a lot of confidence in because more or less Christians have been debating since it was written when they were actually written and in what year. The saints of the 300s have different ideas and modern scholars have different ideas. There's some evidence that some of them were composed very, very early. Like the Gospel of Matthew likely has a Hebrew core or an Aramaic core, the core of the stories, because there's a bunch of things that they say that don't make a lot of sense in Greek because it's not how Greek people talk, but they make sense in Hebrew. And we don't have a Hebrew original. The text that we have is Greek, but it's very, very possible that the core of the Gospel of Matthew is Hebrew, and that is probably the oldest part of the New Testament. The early Christians began this process of collecting and writing down the things from the life of Jesus that they wanted to remember as time goes on, as the apostles start to age. Probably because the fear was that they were the ones that knew him. And they didn't want his memory to disappear. They wanted his sayings, they wanted his life to be told. And so the New Testament in this time period that we're talking about, like first century Christianity, the New Testament is being written. There's some evidence that like when Paul sent his letters, in a couple of cases, he mentions specifically that like get the other letters from the other towns. So that the letters were sent to places like Corinth and Ephesus and Thessalonica and places like that. But that very early on, the Christians started, probably following in their Jewish footsteps, to make copies of the letters and distribute them to other churches. So they didn't consider, for instance, that the letter to the Ephesians was only for the Ephesians to read and not for a whole group of people. Some of them could be a little bit mislabeled. Like there's one that, if you remember when we studied the life of Paul, there were a bunch of towns up in the central part of Anatolia, Turkey, where Paul visited, Lystra, Derbe, if you remember some of those kind of names. He talks about writing a letter to those towns, and there's no like letter to the Lystrians from St. Paul in the New Testament. And so there's this debate about which one of the letters that we have was that one. And I forget if it's the Colossians, or there's one of them that they think that was probably this letter to these towns in the central part of Turkey. And it sort of gets relabeled later. Or it becomes, I forget what it becomes. But the point is that from very early on, the Christians had the mentality of making copies of these New Testament texts. And they're starting to build a New Testament. But it's also important to emphasize that there's no New Testament at this point. So a church, a local church, might have copies of some letters of Paul. The Gospels, the four Gospels, are the earliest part of the canon of Scripture that gets settled. That those are the widely accepted ones, and they basically reject everything else. Those were copied a bit more widely, but it's not until a bit later that you start to get what we would recognize as a New Testament. And different churches had different books that they included as part of their Bible. They didn't all have the same ones right away. So that becomes a debate that we'll sort out as time goes on. But it's just important to remember, because I don't think I've mentioned it very much, that the New Testament is being written in this time that we're talking about in the first century. So, I think that it is very true that Mary goes to live with John toward the end of her life in Ephesus. There's a great amount of history for that. There's a really weird story about the Holy House of Loretto. If you want a bit of medieval piety, but also some really weird possibilities, look up the story of the House of Our Lady at Loretto. It becomes one of the titles of Mary, and the gist of it is that the medieval Christians claim that God reached down and plucked this house out of the Middle East because of the rise of the Muslims and chucked it across the sea, and it landed in Italy. But it is a first century Greek Palestinian dwelling that is in Italy. How it got there is a little bit hard to know. So there is a little bit of medieval legend in that somewhere, I can promise you, because for God to reach down and pluck a house and throw it somewhere is a little bit odd. When you're selling your house, if the Lord did that, you would probably have a stern conversation. Jesus, this is not what I had in mind. I was going to sell the house to a person who buys it and then take the money and buy a different house. Not that I wanted you to move it. James of Zebedee. So James is son of Zebedee. One of the problems in the New Testament is that there are times when it's not clear which James is being spoken about. They don't always tell you. And it's kind of ambiguous. Like in the New Testament, it doesn't always spell out which Mary is being spoken of. And Mary, the name of Mary is Miriam. The Hebrew name would be Miriam. She was the sister of Moses. So that would be a really common name. Not quite to the extent where the Muslims all name their kids Muhammad, but it's close. Like lots of people were named Mary. And so for some time in the church, they all got clumped together, and it became like Mary Magdalene in medieval legend. And now we've sort of separated them out again, like, no, it's probably not all Mary Magdalene. There's other Marys that are involved. But this James is one of the pillars of the early church. St. Paul uses that phrase when he talks about meeting the pillars. He leads with Peter and John, but he is martyred in Jerusalem as the first apostle who dies, likely around 44 AD. The council that happens in the book of Acts, chapter 15, that we talked about in our study on Acts, likely happens around 50. So by 50, the debate is raging between Gentile Christianity and Jewish Christianity. Do you have to follow Jewish law as Gentiles? If you're Jews, do you have to continue to follow Jewish law? That council meets after the death, we think, of this James, the son of Zebedee. Which brings up another lovely puzzle. James, the son of Alphaeus, who is called the brother of the Lord. Most Protestants read this literally and think of him as the brother of Jesus. Catholicism and all of early Christianity reads this as a cousin of Jesus, as someone in his extended family. It is common terminology. One of the things that's very, very different about our time compared to this time is people always lived with their relatives, or almost always. Like, the town was full of 2 or 3 families that were connected. And that was a town. Kids rarely, like 0.005% of the time moved away from their parents when they got married. Or if they did, it was like they moved to the next town over, where their wife or their husband was from. So families were clustered much closer together. You knew your cousins. You knew your grandparents if they were still alive. Those kinship bonds were extremely important. Israel comes out of a tribal society, and tribalism, who's part of your group and who's not part of your group, that's a big deal. So there's a little bit of a mess of language. It does say brother, but it isn't clear what exactly brother means. We take it as a statement of faith. It's one of the dogmas of faith that Mary remains a virgin, which means Mary and Joseph didn't have other children. Some will make the argument that Joseph may have had children before he married Mary, and that he had a wife who died young and in childbirth. Women dying in childbirth was extremely common. And something like, I heard this somewhere, I don't remember in what context, but they suspect that something like 40 to 50% of children didn't make it past their second birthday. Like, it was very, very high. Because remember, there's no way to treat infections. So like the ear infection that wasn't a big deal for you, you had a screaming baby and you went to the doctor and they gave you, antibiotic ear drops. Like, those kind of things would kill children quite often. And you know that young children are much more susceptible to illness than they are even when they're 6 months or a year old. So suffice it to say that this James is likely in the extended family of Jesus somehow. He seems to take a leading role in the Council of Acts, in Acts 15. And people will say, oh, he's in charge and Peter's not, and this whole mess of stuff. It's very, very likely, by tradition, this James becomes the first bishop of Jerusalem. And so the reason why he speaks up in the book of Acts is that he's speaking as a local bishop, and he makes a proposal. But ultimately, they adopt Peter's proposal. I don't think you have to read it as this massive conflict and power game. Lots of modernity is very concerned about power games and who is in charge and yada, yada, yada. It doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to constantly be jockeying for position. I mean, it's possible that the grace of God actually kind of worked, and that these were saints, and they were dealing with the gift of the Holy Spirit, and they weren't all fighting to be number one, because Jesus didn't seem to think that was all that important. It's not about your rank and your position. It's about how you live it. It's about your personal commitment to holiness. This James does seem to have concerns about Gentiles and Jews and that interconnection. And there's tension there. That's what we're going to spend some time talking about in a little bit. There's definitely tension in the early church between the Gentile community and the Jewish community. And they're at loggerheads. And by this, I mean Jewish Christian. So the Christians that come out of Judaism and the Christians that come from the Gentile world. So that's a little bit about James. There are other apostles that it would be great to follow. I mean, I would like to look up, if you have a chance, I would encourage you, read a life of St. Thomas if you can find it from an Indian source, like genuinely Indian, where they would tell the story of where St. Thomas goes in India. Because that does happen in history, where the Portuguese arrive in southern India and they tell him about the tomb of the apostle that's like down the road. And the Portuguese were not expecting a tomb of the apostles or finding Christians at all. And they did, because the western part of the world, Europe, had forgotten, basically, it had been erased from their minds that Christian missionaries went way to the east very early on. And so there were Christians in places like China and India and many of those other countries. There weren't as many of them, that's true. Their communities don't develop like the European ones do. But they were there, and the early Christians do go on mission toward them. Saint Stephen.
I have a question.
Oh, good. Questions are wonderful. You win an award.
Okay, so James,
Mm-hmm.
the son of Zebedee,
Mm-hmm.
who was martyred in Jerusalem, what's his connection to Spain, where it's the St. James of Compostela?
Oh, Santiago de Compostela. That's another great story. So somehow, some of his relics get transported to Spain. I forget. I don't know the exact history.
So he didn't go out there to...
I don't remember. I think one of the claims is that some of the apostles go all the way to the west and then come back. It's just hard to verify. So there's this phrase, like Jesus tells them at the end of the Gospel of Matthew to proclaim the gospel to the ends of the earth. And there's some possibility that they took that very literally and they marched all the way to the western side of Europe, which they thought of as the end of the earth. They didn't know about the ocean and the stuff on the other side. They thought that was it. So I would say it's possible, but again, it could be a little bit of a medieval legend, because, see, the thing about the bones of the apostle is that relics were a big deal, and going on pilgrimage was a big deal, and there became this thing that certain sins could only be cleansed, or the penance required for them was to visit the tomb of an apostle. And it so happened that the only tombs of the apostles in the West are in Rome, and then in Santiago de Compostela. And so that became what was known as the Camino, the way of pilgrimage, and it marches all the way across northern Spain. You can start in various places, but that way is still there. Monsignor Schlesselman, that works at the Newman Center and says Mass for us sometimes, he just did a part of that way of this ancient pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. So it's a little bit challenging. It's a little bit, again, sometimes you're dealing with legend and with story, and it's very possible. I don't want to cast doubt on the possibility. But it's also possible that it got a little bit embellished. There are things that you can't explain without recourse to some tradition and some history, but it's a little bit difficult. You know, like with the relics of the Passion of Jesus, there's no like chain of custody from the death of Jesus to the discovery of the relics. By tradition, they're buried and they dug them up. And they decided that these were the relics of the Passion because of the miracles that were performed when they touched people. And so they sort of declare it and everyone accepts it. But for modern day standards of evidence, we would say that's pretty weak. Like, you went and dug something up 300 years later and decided this is what it is. Now, I think there's good evidence that it is the relics of the Passion, and again, it's not trying to cast doubt on that, but you just have to see that there's a wide field of possibility, and some things really they're lost for hundreds of years. And it's not that no one knew about them, but that the people that wrote things down didn't really know about them. And so, is it possible? Yes. And there's lots of arguments for tradition that are speaking very, very strongly. or for some of these older documents that talk about it. But it's also possible that there's, some gold leaf and some extra, halos added around things that maybe weren't all the way there in the beginning. I think I mentioned the story of Saint Denis in Paris, who by tradition, he gets his head cut off, so he's martyred, and his body picks up his head and carries it in procession out to where he finally drops it. That's quite a story. If you were an executioner, I feel like it would kill just about the entire crowd of people there, because that's not what you expect dead bodies to do. And that could probably cause brain damage and heart failure. And there's no record of mass die-offs of people that saw a dead body carrying its own head marching out of the city. But you also have to explain somehow why the Basilica of St. Denis is out where it is, and why that happened, thousands of years ago, and how it got there, because that's not where he died. So, there are historical puzzles. It gets clearer as time goes on because we have better records. But especially in the early time, like things that come through the medieval ages, medieval piety was something else. We'll get there. But relics were a big deal. So much so, like St. Thomas Aquinas, after he dies, they cut him into pieces and boil him to get his bones. And then his bones get stolen several times in history. Like people come in and raid the town and steal the bones of the saint and bring them to their town, and on and on and on, until most of his relics end up in France, near Toulouse. Why? Hard to say. But it's not something that we do today. Saint Stephen is the first martyr. He's the patron saint of deacons. One of the things, again, that's not super clear at this point in history is the title of deacon. It's easy to read deacon and think deacons as in the modern world, and that's the way most people read it. But it does seem that Stephen does a number of things. They use a bunch of language about him in the scriptures that's associated with priesthood. Like his service at the table, they actually use a formal title or a formal phrase that denotes like celebrating the liturgy, which wouldn't be the role of a deacon. That would be the role of a priest. So it's possible that there is a bit of blending at this time in history. Stephen still makes a great patron saint of deacons. It's wonderful. There's 7 of them that are chosen in the Acts of the Apostles. I just picked him because I realized eventually that I had to just start picking people and couldn't tell every story of every saint that there ever is, or we would never get anywhere, which is already a problem. If you have complaints, write a letter to my secretary. Stephen is this deacon who is by tradition the first martyr. Now, later tradition will recognize the holy innocents that died, the babies that die in Bethlehem because of Herod, as martyrs as well. But he's by tradition called the first martyr, the proto-martyr. He gives this speech, and that's where a few of these lines come from, in front of the Jewish people when they arrest him, that all have played a part in the death of Jesus, and all are invited to new life through him. So that all of us, he talks specifically about the Jewish leadership that he's talking to, but he definitely emphasizes a kind of universality. This forms part of the core of the gospel message. St. Paul will say, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. No one is righteous, not even one, but we are saved through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. This language becomes very important. Stephen seems to have preached for some time. He certainly was concerned about the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, and he takes kind of a hard stance on Christianity, and he's killed for it. He's very, very forceful in his argument about the role of the Jews in the death of Jesus. Stephen probably didn't get killed right after he was ordained. It's not like he's ordained and then he gives this one speech and they don't like him and then they decide to kill him. That'd be pretty extraordinary. It could happen. It's not clear, but it's very, very possible that there's some time in there. He lives a life like Jesus, and so the scriptures use a lot of language that's similar to Jesus' trial and death in his death. He seems to die sometime between 33 and 36 AD, which is likely around, is a few years after Jesus' resurrection and ascension. He becomes the example and type of all of the martyrs. St. Paul, good old St. Paul. Paul is a Jew from Tarsus, that's a city in southern Turkey. He has this name changed to Paul, Saul, Paul. We don't know if that's something that Jesus did or it was something like Saul was a Hebrew name and Paul is a Greek name. People probably had names that they used in other languages. One of the great parts, if you have grandkids today, is that very often when you're learning another language, you choose a name that is in that language just to kind of use as a sort of honorary thing, or you pick something that sounds nice. But the early Christians probably did that too. If you meet people from Vietnam, this is one of the most funny things, because most of their real names are almost unpronounceable to English speakers, because Vietnamese is a tonal language, which means how you say it is as important as the letters that it uses, like whether your voice is rising or falling and those kind of things. They're very, very hard for people who grew up in a non-tonal language world to adapt to. So most of the time when you meet Vietnamese Christians, they'll give you the name that they were baptized with. So I had classmates and we called them Vincent and Thomas. I have no idea what their real names were. Teachers tried to pronounce it a few times, and eventually they just stood up and said, "Call me Thomas, call me Vincent." They just use their baptismal name for their name when they're dealing with Western people, because their original ones are very challenging to pronounce. That could be Paul. He's likely born around 10 AD. He was a Roman citizen through his father. So Roman citizenship was something that you inherited from your parents if you were one. You could gain it in other ways, like serving in the army, or it could be given to you by the Senate and a few other things. But if you were a Roman citizen, then your children are Roman citizens. He is a Pharisee in the school of Gamaliel. He's one of the early rabbis. He shows up in the New Testament a few times. He also shows up in a monstrous is a massive Jewish work called the Talmud, which, would be good bedtime reading for most of you. It's just about like prescription sleeping pills, because it's rabbis that debate each other. I mean, sometime if you really want a good sleeping pill, pick up some dense philosophy, like Immanuel Kant or Hegel, and you read it after a while and you're like, I don't know what it said. Probably works like a charm. Very few people talk about it. I'll start my prescription service later.